So hello and welcome to this NPTEL course on Feminist Writings, where we're looking at Bell Hook's essay Understanding Patriarchy. We have already had some lectures on this text, and we'll just continue, we'll just pick up from where we left last time. So just to have a very quick rehearsal of what this essay does in terms of its content, in terms of its function, in terms of its discursive analysis, and the reason why it's important, significant, very, very significant and urgently important for any course in feminist writings is because it looks at patriarchy as a condition, as an experiential condition, as something which affects men as well as women. And as I may have already said earlier, that it entirely deconstructs this very blunt binary between the perpetrating male and the passively suffering woman. And it looks at patriarchy as a condition which affects men perhaps more than women, and it affects men to the point of making them different from what they really are. So patriarchy is defined very early on in this essay as a disease, as a medical condition, and we have a series of medical metaphors with which this essay is written. And now the other important thing about this essay is it gives a lot of anecdotal analysis. It doesn't restrict itself into a dry textual analysis. It actually gives examples from Bell Hook's own life in terms of her experiences in a middle-class southern household and the differences, the discrimination that she suffered as a female child in a very conservative household, which then becomes a model, a micro-model of a patriarchal operation. And she said, if you remember last time, she said that this model is replicated in more macro spaces such as nation, religion, nationalism, etc. But the micro model is the family, in which patriarchy first operates as a constricting principle, a dominating principle. And she makes it very clear at the very outset of the essay that patriarchy is something which is perpetrated by men as well as by women, and there are covert and overt enactments of patriarchy. So there are overt ways in which you can enact patriarchy through physical domination, through coercion, through abuse, violence, etc. And there are more covert ways in which you can perpetrate patriarchy by manufacturing consent, by making you a consensual subscriber, a consensual consumer of patriarchy. And she says that a covert model of domination, the covert model of patriarchal performance, it works more surreptitiously, obviously, because it's covert, but it's oftentimes assumed by women, it's oftentimes assumed by the female members of a household. And we have an example coming up, a very disturbing, unsettling example, where she talks about how when she seemed to subvert a certain norm in the household, a certain norm of play in the household, she was punished. She was taken to task by first the perpetrating father, who takes her to task by beating her physically, and then later, subsequently, by the mother, who becomes equally patriarchal by trying to convince her that this beating, this confinement that she was subjected to is meant to do her good, is meant to benefit her in the long run. And that's important in our analysis as well. So this is the section that we look at today in some details, and we'll study it how, in terms of how that becomes a very good example of the enactments of patriarchy in the daily discourses around us. So this should be on your screen, where she talks about her own experiences as a female child in a farm country growing up in America in that point of time, in the 60s presumably. We lived in a farm country, isolated from other people. Our sense of gender roles was learned from our parents, from the ways we saw them behave. My brother and I remember our confusion about gender. In reality, I was stronger and more violent than my brother, which we learned quickly was bad. And he was a gentle, peaceful boy, which we learned was really bad. So again, look at the way in which the attributes peaceful, violent, gentle, these are very conveniently mapped onto gender roles. So the boys in the household are meant to be more violent and articulate and assertive, whereas the girls are more sort of meant to be docile and submissive and gentle. Now what happens when it becomes the other way around, when the girl becomes more assertive and dominating and violent, as is the case over here? So it becomes a bit of a problem in a household, in a patriarchal household, and then there are certain steps, certain measures taken to correct the problem. So although we were often confused, we knew one fact for certain: we could not be and act the way we wanted to, doing what we felt like. So in the very immediate sense, we have a crisis of agency over here, which has been described. And she says quite clearly that, we learned very early on in our lives that we are meant to conform to certain codes of behavior, certain manly codes of behavior, certain feminine codes of behavior, which took away our sense of agency. We could not be what we really wanted to be, but rather we were expected to be something else, someone else, in conformity to certain codes of conduct. So it was clear to us that our behavior had to follow a predetermined, gendered script. So the word script is very important over here. So it's something which is pre-written, it's a narrative which is already written for you, and it is your job as a obedient boy or an obedient girl to conform to the codes and the narrative. So that pre-written script becomes a very important metaphor of domination, a very important metaphor of subjugation of the human subject, which is at play over here. So patriarchy operates through a pre-written script, through a gendered script. It's very heavily gendered in quality because it sets out the codes of conduct. It maps out the codes of conduct quite clearly, as is the case over here. We both learned the word patriarchy in our adult life. When we learned that a script that had determined what we should be, the identities we should make, was based on patriarchal values and beliefs about gender. So interestingly, the word patriarchy, and this is something which she keeps talking about throughout this essay, the word patriarchy rarely occurs in common conversations. It rarely occurs in daily discourses of interactions. So she says quite clearly we learn the word patriarchy much later in life, and then we retrospectively realized that we had all along conforming to certain codes of patriarchy, certain codes of conduct set out by patriarchal principles, patriarchal values and beliefs about gender. So the word patriarchy occurs later because this is something which, as it talks about quite extensively, that this reluctance to address the question of patriarchy, this reluctance to pinpoint patriarchy as a core problem which affects men and women equally, which affects abuse, which informs abuse, which determines abuse, which causes abuse in various forms. It could be verbal abuse, physical abuse, emotional abuse. But Hook says quite clearly that it is a reluctance in academic discourses as well as in common conversations to talk about patriarchy, to address patriarchy, to take the bull by the head, as it were. And this reluctance to do it is a problem that she seeks to address, she seeks to talk more about. So, and then she talks about how, as growing up as a girl child in a very patriarchal, conservative household was a problem because she very quickly realized she wasn't able to do the things she wanted to do because those were not in conformity to the codes of behavior expected of her. And she says quite clearly, and I quote, "I was always more interested in challenging patriarchy than my brother was because it was a system which was leaving me out of things I wanted to be a part of." So there's a very clear hierarchy at work over here. There's a very clear politics of privilege at work over here. And the entire discourse of patriarchy, the entire narrative of patriarchy is designed in a way to sort of benefit or privilege the male, and sort of leave out the woman from certain things that she wants to do, certain privileges that she wants to enjoy as a person, as a human subject. And she very quickly figures this out in life that, and this makes them more subversive, this makes them more disobedient, this makes them more questioning in terms of challenging the norms of patriarchy. And she says quite clearly that I was angry, I was discontented because I found out very quickly that this was a system which is leaving me out of things which I wanted to do in real life. And now we come to the very interesting example of a game, a play, a child's play in this particular family, and how even something as seemingly innocent, as seemingly innocuous as a play, a child's game, can become deeply discursive in quality in terms of being mapped into certain codes of gendered behavior. And she says over here that the example she gives is the play of marbles. And she says quite clearly that marbles was meant to be a boys' game. It's something that little boys played with. It wasn't something which was supposed to be appropriated by girls. I mean, girls are supposed to play with something else, dolls, kitchen utensils, presumably. And again, we have a very stereotypical, regressive mapping of toys over here. So even, and this is how patriarchy works. I mean, it starts from the very inception. When a girl child is born and a boy child is born, they're given very different instruments of play. And obviously, the priority, the intention over here is to map out the different kinds of activities expected of a girl child, expected of a male child. And she says over here, in our family life of the 50s, so this is 50s America, marbles was a boys' game. So marbles is a very common game that we have even in our part of the world. And she says quite clearly it was meant to be a boys' game. It was meant to be played by male children. My brother had inherited his marbles from men in the family. So again, look at the sort of patriarchal legacy at work over here. Marbles become a metaphor of that legacy. This little boy, her brother, inherits a marble, the box of marbles, from his father, who presumably had inherited that from his father. So it's like a chain of acquisitions, a chain of agentic acquisitions, something which is given to you as a male child, something which is bestowed on you as a male child, something which you must embody as a male child. It's a legacy that you embody, you're meant to embody as a male child. So he had a tin box to keep them in. So the box, the marbles become quite symbolic objects over here. And this is the interesting thing about this essay. It takes up different kind of discourse analysis, which oftentimes forces us to look at objects as more than just objects. They transcend or transgress the literal value and take up symbolic signifiers or symbolic registers of significance over here. So the marbles over here, they become quite symbolic in quality, as we'll very quickly figure out. So the brother, the male child, had a tin box to keep the marbles in, all sizes and shapes marvelously colored. They were, to my eye, the most beautiful objects. So they were like the most coveted objects in the girl child's imagination. We played together with them, often with me aggressively clinging to the marble I liked best, refusing to share. So again, this is not in conformity to the accepted or expected code of conduct. So a girl child is not supposed to play with the marble in the first place. She's supposed to play with something else, other things, other toys, but she's more interested in marbles, and she seems to be more assertive in terms of clinging on to the marbles that she liked best. When Dad was at work, our stay-at-home mom was quite content to see us playing marbles together. Yet Dad, looking at a play from a patriarchal perspective, was disturbed by what he saw. So notice how the word Dad is written in a capital D over here. So again, like marbles, Dad becomes a symbolic figure, a symbolically phallocentric figure, a protector of patriarchy, a promoter of patriarchy over here in this household. So Dad, Big Daddy over here, was not very happy in terms of looking at the girl child playing with marbles. So he was a bit disturbed, he was a bit unhappy about it. So why was he unhappy? Why was he disturbed at what he saw? And this is what he saw. His daughter, aggressive and competitive, was a better player than his son, and that's almost unacceptable. So his son turns out to be a worse player, a more meek player, a less competitive player of marbles. And the idea of being competitive, the idea of being hostile, the idea of being aggressive. So these are very stereotypically manly attributes which the girl child here seems to be appropriating. So that becomes a problem to the very patriarchal father figure observing it all. His son was passive. The boy did not really seem to care who won and was willing to give over marbles on demand. So the son was not really being very assertive over here. So the assertive self, the assertive agentic self seems to be the girl child, which is a problem to the patriarchal perspective. So Dad decided that this play had to end, that both my brother and I needed to learn a lesson about appropriate gender roles. So if you look at the sentence carefully, Dad decided. So there's a degree of authority which is being asserted over here. So there's no, it's completely undemocratic, it's completely non-consensual. It's a decision taken by the father figure, the patriarchal phallocentric figure, and that has an absolute authority to it. So Dad decided that this play had to end. It must come to an end. And both my brother and I needed to learn a lesson about appropriate gender roles. So Dad decided to teach them a lesson in terms of telling them what to do and what not to do. So in the process, he would tell off the girl child for playing with marbles, and he would tell off the male child for not being assertive or competitive enough, as was the case over here. One evening, my brother was given permission by Dad to bring out the tin of marbles. So again, look at the word permission and what it is doing over here. So the big daddy, the big father figure, permitted or allowed the male child to bring out the tin of marbles. I announced my desire to play and was told by my brother the girls did not play with marbles. It was a boys' game. So we have a scene of increasing indoctrination. So a male child is being taught that this is something which girls ought not to play with. So this is not a plaything for the girls. They ought to play with other things, dolls, kitchenwares, kitchen utensils, etc. And marbles were very much a manly, a boy game, a boy toy to be played with. And girls should not indulge in this kind of an activity because it's something that they ought not to do. So there's a bit of a moral mapping at work over here. So even the toy belongs to the male child. So it's the boy who's supposed to play with that symbolic toy, marbles, whereas the girl is disallowed or barred from any kind of engagement with that. So the whole scene becomes quite swiftly symbolic in quality. That's something we'll see very quickly. Now, she was told by the brother that you're not supposed to play with marbles because it doesn't belong to you. This is not the right thing for a girl. This made no sense to my 4 or 5-year-old mind, and I insisted on my right to play by picking up marbles and shooting them. Dad intervened to tell me to stop. I did not listen. His voice grew louder and louder. Then suddenly he snatched me up, broke a board from a screen door, and began to beat me with it, telling me, "You're just a little girl. When I tell you to do something, I mean for you to do it." He beat me and he beat me, wanting me to acknowledge that I understood what I had done. His rage, his violence captured everyone's attention. Our family sat spellbound, wrapped before the pornography of patriarchal violence. After this beating, I was banished, forced to stay alone in the dark. Mama came into the bedroom to soothe the pain, telling me in a soft southern voice, "I tried to warn you. You need to accept that you're just a little girl and girls can't do what boys do." In service to patriarchy, her task was to reinforce that Dad had done the right thing by putting me in my place, by restoring the natural social order. So this is a deeply disturbing scene. Even as a casual reader of this essay, we feel deeply disturbed by what is being described over here. It's unsettling, it's depressing, it's extremely disintegrating as a reader to read. But what is happening essentially is the girl child is being chastised, is being abused corporeally, beating essentially. So the violence is targeted at her body by being subversive, for being subversive. So because she insists on playing with the marbles, she doesn't obey the words of the father figure. She's taken to task at first verbally and then physically. She's beaten viciously, violently, almost pornographically by the father figure in a bid to make her conform to the codes that she is supposed to conform to. And it doesn't stop there. After the beating gets done, and she's sort of pressurized to acknowledge the authority of the father, and then afterwards she is banished in a small room, confined there as a continuation of the punishment. And all this is very, very unsettling, very disturbing to us as readers today. But this is a scene which happens in several situations, in several households. And Hooks obviously is offering an example, a very graphic example of the very disturbing quality of patriarchy at work, in operation over here. And interestingly, what happens immediately after is this: the mother figure comes and reinforces the authority of the father by comforting the girl child by saying that, we tried to warn you, I tried to warn you, but it wouldn't listen to me. Dad is doing the right thing by beating you, by putting you in place, by telling you what to do and what not to do. This is designed to do you a service in the long run. So again, we have, like I said a little while earlier, we have two different orders of patriarchy at work. One, the overt order of patriarchy, as embodied by the very phallocentric authority figure of the father, who is beating the girl child, abusing the girl child, meting out violence on the girl child. And then we have the covert patriarchal order, which is embodied by the mother, who is coming and in a bid to comfort the girl child, trying to reinforce the patriarchal principle at play over here. So she is as much a partner to this patriarchal discourse as the father is. So both are perpetrators in different degrees, and that's the whole point that has been trying to be what Hooks is trying to convey in this episode. So as she mentions quite clearly towards the end of this paragraph, in service to patriarchy, her task was to reinforce that Dad had just done the right thing by putting me in my place, by restoring the natural social order. So as we can see by now, there's nothing natural about this order. It's an entirely unnatural, artificial order. But this artificiality, this unnaturalness is naturalized and then normativized by the principles of patriarchy through acts of repetition, through acts of confirmation and then repetition. So repetition becomes a very important principle for any grand narrative. So you need to constantly conform to certain codes, and this constant confirmation becomes a ritual of repetition, and this ritual of repetition then naturalizes and then normativizes the patriarchal principle, which is in itself an artificial and unnatural principle. That's something which has been described quite graphically in this particular episode. And then she goes on to say, I remember this traumatic event so well. So one can imagine the trauma that a girl child had experienced when this was being done on her. First being beaten, corporally, physically by the father figure, and then banished in a small dark room in order to suffer, in order to continue the punishment that she had deserved by not conforming to the patriarchal codes. So I remember this traumatic event so well because it was a story told again and again within our family. So again, look at the ritual of repetition at play, at work over here, and this is one of the conditions of a grand narrative. As I just said earlier, repetition becomes a very important instrument through which a discourse is consolidated, an artificial discourse is consolidated and then naturalized and then normativized. No one cared that a constant retelling might trigger post-traumatic stress. The retelling was necessary to reinforce both the message and the remembered state of absolute powerlessness. So the entire repetition was meant to reinforce the patriarchal order. And so the word post-traumatic stress is normally used for war veterans, for soldiers in the war, but observe how this adjective, this particular category is used in a domestic space. So the family space, the domestic space, the familial space, the home space, the homely space becomes quite dramatically defamiliarized over here. It becomes almost like a battleground of codes of conduct. And if you don't conform to the codes of conduct, you're punished as a soldier would be punished. And then the post-traumatic stress that occurs to you is something which is akin to the post-traumatic stress which happens to soldiers and war veterans. So this becomes very much a battleground. The apparently, the supposedly tranquil familial space becomes the battleground of gender roles. So the retelling, the repetition was a necessary ritual to reinforce the message of authority and the message of domination in a girl child's imagination, and also to reinforce in the mind her own powerlessness, our own agency-lessness in this patriarchal authority space. The recollection of this brutal whipping of a little girl daughter by a big strong man served as more than just a reminder to me of my gendered place. It was a reminder to everyone watching, remembering to all my siblings, male and female, and to a grown woman mother, that our patriarchal father was the ruler in our household. So it almost takes a primitive quality where the ruler of the household is the male, the hunter male, and everyone else has to obey. It's part of the ancient primal kinship system, the primal family system, where the hunter male was the strongest male in the pack, and everyone else was supposed to serve him or obey him in terms of his authority figure. This spectacle of punishment, which is enacted away in terms of beating the girl child with a whip, essentially with a whip, is meant to serve as a reminder, a visual reminder, a spectacular reminder of the authority figure in the house, which is localized almost entirely in the big, strong father, and everyone else is supposed to watch it and remember the figure of authority. And this was a reminder of what? We were to remember that if we did not obey his rules, we would be punished even unto death. So the brutality of the beating over here, the barbaric quality of the beating over here is almost strategic in quality, because it serves to remind you that you can be beaten to death effectively if you do not obey the patriarchal rules. In other words, you don't exist in this household. You can be made to vanish and disappear, and you can be a disembodied person if you do not conform to the patriarchal rules of this household. And it's a very disturbing, unsettling, depressing episode which has been described over here, but it serves to convey the function of patriarchy in a household like this, and how everyone becomes a complicit partner, collusive to the order of patriarchy. So one could be the principal perpetrator. The principal perpetrator over here is obviously the father figure, but everyone else becomes partakers of this performance, partners of this performance, with their silence and with their benevolent reinforcement, the more comforting reinforcement, which happens later, as is a case with the mother over here. So this was a reminder. We were to remember that if we did not obey his rules, we would be punished even unto death. This is the way we were experientially schooled in the art of patriarchy. So again, look at the last sentence over here. It's a very loaded sentence. We were experientially schooled in the art of patriarchy. So patriarchy becomes an art. Obviously, it's a perverse art. It's a performance. It's a theater of a certain kind, a certain code of conduct. And this theater of patriarchy, this theater of cruelty, if you will, we have to be experientially schooled into this. So experientiality, as I may have already mentioned, becomes a very important component of patriarchy over here, and it's something which is examined quite deeply by bell hooks. So she isn't really looking at patriarchy as just a text. So this one sentence combines the textuality and the experientiality components quite skillfully. So the art of patriarchy is a textual quality of patriarchy, the theater of patriarchy, the coded quality of patriarchy, if you will. And the experientiality of patriarchy is the actual embodied experience of living or suffering or being subjected to that particular discourse. So both combine together to make patriarchy what it really is. So this is something which is interesting, and as Hooks keeps referring to her anecdotal episodes in terms of conveying to us the entire idea of patriarchy and how it operates in a different kind of spatial setting. So in a family setting, it operates in a particular way. In a broader macro public space, it operates in a different way. In a military space, it operates in a different way. In a sporting arena, it might take over a different code altogether. But underlying everything, there is this authority of the father figure, which is a constant in all the different settings at play. So then she quickly goes on to say there's nothing unique or even exceptional about this experience. Listen to the voices of wounded grown children raised in patriarchal homes, and you will hear different versions with the same underlying theme: the use of violence to reinforce our indoctrination and acceptance of patriarchy. So it's obviously an indoctrination which happens psychologically as well as corporeally, because you're trained to replicate, you're trained to appropriate and then replicate the principles of patriarchy. And then she mentions, she alludes to a therapist, a work by a therapist, Terence Real, which is entitled "How Can I Get Through to You?", which talks about how this kind of the psychology of indoctrination is at play. So in "How Can I Get Through to You?", family therapist Terence Real tells how his sons were initiated into patriarchal thinking even as the parents worked to create a loving home in which anti-patriarchal values prevailed. He tells of how his young son Alexander enjoyed dressing as Barbie until boys playing with his older brother witnessed his Barbie persona and let him know by the gaze that their shocked, disapproving silence that his behavior was unacceptable. So we have an interesting case of cross-dressing. So we have Alexander, who is presumably a male child. So he enjoys dressing up as Barbie, the Barbie doll persona. So he appropriates the Barbie persona, but obviously that is subjected to a very, very disapproving gaze, a collective gaze, which doesn't approve this persona at all, coming from a male child. So it was a gaze of shock, a gaze of discontent, a gaze of disapproval in which he is subjected to. And that gaze tells him or conveys to him the unacceptability of this kind of an appropriation. This behavior was unacceptable. So without a shred of malevolence, the stare my son received transmitted a message: you are not to do this. And the medium that message was broadcast in was a potent emotion: shame. At 3, Alexander was learning the rules. A 10-second wordless transaction was powerful enough to dissuade my son from that instant forward from what had been a favorite activity. I call such moments of induction the normal traumatization of boys. So this is Terence Real talking about his son, Alexander, and how the son, who initially enjoyed dressing up as Barbie, initially enjoyed playing with dolls, presumably, is subjected to a gaze, a collective gaze of silence and disapproval, which shocks them and which makes them ashamed. And shame becomes a very important sentiment over here. And that obviously leads on to indoctrination into the hegemonic patriarchal principles at play. So it was a change from what had been a favorite activity, so it just drops in immediately. And Terence Real describes such moments of induction normal traumatization. So look at the seemingly oxymoronic quality over here, normal traumatization. So it's a traumatization which is meant to create a sense of normalcy, right? So it's a traumatization out of our desire, out of a compulsion, not a desire, a compulsion to be normal, to be normativized. So it's a tyranny of normativization. It's a trauma of normativization which is at play over here. So the normal order demands a certain degree of conformity, and that demand creates in you a sense of trauma, a sense of shame that then propels you to drop your agentic self and then go on to conform the codes that are demanded by the order of normalcy. So hence the normal traumatization is a very interesting, a very loaded phrase over here. So to indoctrinate boys into the rules of patriarchy, we force them to feel pain and to deny their feelings. So feelings become a very important symbol over here. So Hooks will go on to say that the real victims, the first victims of patriarchy, are boys who are forced to move away from the feelings, who are forced to move away from their feeling emotional self, and then made to appropriate hardcore patriarchal selves in conformity to certain rules of conduct and conformity to certain codes of conduct. So they become the first victims of patriarchy. So what this essay does, among many radical things, it entirely problematizes the ontology of victimhood. It says it's not, it's a bit of a reductionist strategy to look at women being as victims of patriarchy and men being as perpetrators of patriarchy. The first victims of patriarchy are boys who are trained to do certain things which they otherwise would not have done, who are trained to indoctrinate into certain kind of discourses, certain kind of ideologies which they wouldn't have, preferred otherwise. So that becomes the first crisis of agency, the first real victim of patriarchy. And then they become perpetrators of patriarchy, they become performers of patriarchy, and then they perpetrate patriarchy into other boys and girls, and the women and everyone around them. Okay, and then Hooks says, my stories took place in the 50s. So the story about being beaten by the phallocentric authority figure in the house, brutally being beaten up until she had to acknowledge the authority of the father figure and then confined to a dark room as part of a continuation of the punishment. So these took place in the 50s. The story's Real tells a reason. So the more recent stories that Terence Real is telling or discussing as case studies of this kind of condition. They all underscore the tyranny of patriarchal thinking, the power of patriarchal culture to hold us captive. So the word captive is important over here because it talks about the imprisonment which happens to the patriarchy. So patriarchy imprisons you in some kind of an artificial behavior which you're trained to regard as normal, normative, natural, and quality. Real is one of the most enlightened thinkers, Terence Real is one of the most enlightened thinkers on the subject of patriarchal masculinity in our nation. And yet, he lets readers know that he's not able to keep his boys out of patriarchy's reach. So patriarchy becomes like an epidemic. Again, it's a bit of a medical metaphor which is at play over here. So everyone is affected by patriarchy. So even Terence Real, who's a very, very sort of progressive psychologist, a therapist, even he cannot keep his own sons away from the clutches of patriarchy, the reaches of patriarchy. They become consumed by patriarchal principles, which then they replicate and perform in different settings. They suffer as assaults, as do all boys and girls to a greater or lesser degree. No doubt by creating a loving home that is not patriarchal, Real at least offers his boys a choice. They can choose to be themselves, or they can choose conformity with patriarchal roles. Real uses the term psychological patriarchy to describe the patriarchal thinking common to females and males. So patriarchy becomes, first of all, a psychological condition whereby you are trained to think in certain ways, you're trained to sort of carry out your responses, your emotional responses to in certain kinds of conduct, in certain codes of conduct. Despite the contemporary visionary feminist thinking that makes clear that a patriarchal thinker need not be a male, most folks continue to see men as a problem of patriarchy. This is simply not the case. Women can be as wedded to patriarchal thinking and action as men. So this is what makes the essay really complex and interesting, because it takes, it offers a very complex take on patriarchy. It talks about how it's reductionist and perhaps erroneous in many levels, at many levels, to talk about patriarchy being as something which is carried out by men only, and men being the problem of patriarchy, the perpetrators of patriarchy, which is simply not the case, as Hooks argues quite compellingly. She says, again very compellingly, the woman can be as wedded, and the metaphor of wedded is very important over here, as part of an institutional partnership. if you will. So this institutional partnership to patriarchy is carried out by women as much as by men, and they can sort of carry out, they can enact patriarchy in more covert ways, in more surreptitious ways, as was the case with Hook's own mother in the scene, in that situation where she was being brutally beaten by the father figure. Instead of coming and intervening in that barbaric, pornographic scene of violence, the mother comes to the end when the violence has been done and committed, and the girl child has been banished, and then she comes to the end to soothe her, comfort her, and in the process of comforting her, actually consolidating the act of the father in terms of teaching the girl a lesson to conform to the right course of conduct. Okay, so then she refers to John Bradshaw's book on creating this kind of a situation, creating love. So she says Bradshaw in this particular book defines thus, and I quote Bradshaw, as Hooks mentions over here, the dictionary defines patriarchy as a social organization marked by the supremacy of the father in the clan or family in both domestic and religious functions. The word clan is very important over here because it has a primal quality to it. So it's like an old clans, old tribes, old pack systems where the strongest male is the leader by default, the figure of authority by default. So patriarchy is characterized by male domination and power. So domination and power become very important instruments in patriarchy. He states, Bradshaw, he states further that patriarchal rules still govern most of the world's religious, school systems and family systems. So religions, schools, families, the different institutions of indoctrination, they're all consumed, they're all sort of embedded in patriarchal principles, right? So as a result of which children grow up being indoctrinated, consuming those principles by default, unquestioningly. Describing the most damaging of these rules, Bradshaw lists blind obedience, the foundation upon which patriarchy stands, the repression of all emotions except fear, the destruction of individual willpower, and the repression of thinking whenever it departs from the authority figures' ways of thinking. Patriarchal thinking shapes the values of a culture. We are socialized into the system, males, females, as well as males. Most of us learned patriarchal attitudes in our family of origin, and they are usually taught to us by our mothers. These attitudes were reinforced in schools and religious institutions. So there's a degree of compulsory effacement of all emotions. You're not supposed to be emotional, you're not supposed to have a feeling self. Fear becomes the governing principle, the governing emotion, the governing sentiment over here. If you're not conforming to patriarchal codes, then you can fear punishment, you can fear shame, and then women over here become very covert carriers of patriarchy, which is reinforced in schools and religious institutions. So the family becomes the first micro space where this indoctrination takes place, and then there are more macro spaces such as schools and institutions where these attitudes are reinforced and replicated. The contemporary presence of female-headed households has led many people to assume that children in these households are not learning patriarchal values because no male is present. So again, we are moving away from a sense of biological determinism or biological essentialism. So this is something which is a very radical move, a radical departure, which is offered by Hooks over here. So she's saying just because the male is biologically absent in a household doesn't make the household more progressive by default. So there are instances, several instances of households which are run entirely by women where no male is present at all, either because they're dead or absent. That doesn't make the household less patriarchal in quality. In some cases, it makes it more patriarchal in quality, as we'll see in a moment. So it's erroneous to assume that the children in those households are not learning patriarchal values just because no male is present. On the contrary, they assume that the assumption is the men are the sole teachers of patriarchal thinking. Yet many female-headed households endorse and promote patriarchal thinking with far greater passion than two-parent households. So this will not appear shocking at all, because we're just seeing how patriarchy is something which is perpetrated by men as well as by women, in different forms and different disguises and different activities. So it doesn't just make it progressive by default just because a male doesn't happen to be there physically. The woman can be as patriarchal, perhaps more patriarchal on certain occasions than the father figures, the biological father figures. So because they do not have an experiential reality to challenge false fantasies of gender roles, women in such households are far more likely to idealize the patriarchal male role and patriarchal men than are women who live with the patriarchal men every day. So in households where there are no patriarchal men, women sometimes tend to romanticize or idealize the patriarchal absent male. So the absent male becomes a figure of idealization, a figure of reverence, and as a result of which, what is produced out of that effect is a complete conformity, or perhaps a reinforcement of patriarchy in a way which is more intense than in a normal household, quote-unquote normal household, with a father figure as well as a mother figure. So, single-parent households run entirely by women can be more crudely or more oppressingly patriarchal than households which have a mother as well as a father, as the case which Hooks is sort of examining over here. So, the degree of idealization which is at work over here, idealizing the absent male, the absent patriarchal figure, who becomes something like a spectral presence, and then that makes patriarchy more unquestionable over here. You can't really question patriarchy at all because there's no real male present. The real male will make errors. The real male will have lapses, but the absent male, the unreal male, the father figure who's not there, will be the perfect idealized father figure, and hence that particular household will always have the effect, emanating out of it, which will make it more patriarchal in quality. So that's something which Hooks is very quick to discern and make a distinction. So we need to highlight the role women play in perpetuating and sustaining patriarchal culture, so that we will recognize patriarchy as a system women and men support equally, even if men receive more rewards from that system. So women become more, as complicit partners of patriarchy as men are. So, we need to look at a complex model of patriarchy, not just a model where men perpetrate and women suffer, but as a more complex model where women and men both become partners of patriarchy in different degrees. Dismantling and changing patriarchal culture is work that men and women must do together. So this is the final bit with which I'll wind up this lecture. So what she's offering over here, what she is sort of urgently calling for, is a more inclusive model of feminism, is a more inclusive, a more complex model of feminism, where men and women come together as collaborators to question patriarchy. Right? So this is moving away from this very blunt feminist reading, which looks at women as heroic sufferers and men as cruel perpetrators or perverse perpetrators. So it moves away from that blunt feminist binary and takes a more inclusive feminist model, a more inclusive gender studies model, where men and women become equal partners of patriarchy and equal sufferers of patriarchy as well. And she says quite clearly, if we are to dismantle the system, if we are to deconstruct the system, that dismantling or that deconstruction can only take place if men and women come together and collaborate together. They become collaborators in examining patriarchy, in questioning patriarchy, in deconstructing patriarchy. So the move is towards a more collaborative, a more inclusive model of feminism, a more inclusive model of gender subversion, rather than retaining the binaristic, the dualistic model of patriarchy, a dualistic model of feminism, which actually can become patriarchal in quality because it retains a structural divide, it retains a functional divide, it retains the presuppositions that patriarchy enjoys and promotes. So we need to break away from the presuppositions altogether, and we can only break away from those presuppositions if we take a more collaborative, a more dialogic relationship, a more dialogic principle at play, where men and women come together as sufferers of patriarchy, as people who are trying to subvert patriarchy, as collaborators. Only then can patriarchy be dismantled as a system. And that's what Hooks is arguing at this point. So we'll stop at this point today, and we'll continue with this text in the next lectures to come. Thank you for your attention.